Buenos días, querido Ian.
Buenos dias. Very good to see you again, Alex. Gosh, and today we're going to approach this last chapter, and I think neither of us feel this is going to be at all easy. I mean, I should say that nothing I've ever written has ever caused me so much pain as writing this chapter in terms of the hard work and the rewriting and so on. The chapter alone took me a year, roughly speaking, to write.
Wow.
Um, and of course, the point is that the area of the sacred and the divine is notoriously refractory to language, and everything that you say about it is going to be untrue. As it says in the Tao Te Ching, he who knows does not tell, he who tells does not know. So that leaves us in a difficult position. Perhaps we should just end this conversation now.
Well, if it helps at all, and I know you value feedback from your readers, yes, this has been a tough chapter, but it has culminated the book for me. And probably that's what a last chapter should do, but it's not easy. And I've had many realizations while while reading this book, and it has left me speechless. Although I'm not speaking when I'm while I'm reading it. So let's go through it. I think there's a lot, and I value that you share that it took you so long and how difficult it was, because all this huge resistance, I think, has created what we've been discussing throughout this chapter. So it's a testament and an embodiment of your whole corpus here. What has happened when you wrote it and what happens when we read it, I think.
Well, that's great to hear. Um, yes, it certainly is an example of how resistance is what is required in doing creative work.
Yes.
And yes, I encountered a good deal of it. I suppose, I mean, I should say that several people who had read the manuscript of the book up to this point said, I don't think you should deal with the sacred or divine, because there are people who will say that even talking about it means that your philosophy can be dismissed because you're some sort of a faith head,
Mm.
as Dawkins and Dennett call them. But I think it would have been, I mean, it would actually have been impossible for me to leave this chapter out. It would be like having playing a melody and then refusing to play the final chords,
Yes, yes, yes.
because it's somehow in keeping with the rest of what I'm talking about, and I do think it's an incredibly important topic. And there are all sorts of good reasons why it may have fallen out of public discourse these days, which we can talk about, and
Mm.
a lot with hemispheric differences, I think. But the fact that it is almost impossible to talk about um, doesn't let one off the hook, because if
Mm.
one's simply silent on it, it seems as though one has no interest in it and nothing. It plays no important role in the picture. It does play a very important role, but it also hides from language and from the process of exposition in
Mm.
normal philosophy. So it's a conundrum.
And yes, as I recall, at the end of chapter 25, you made that remark both for consciousness and the sacred, saying that not saying anything about them would have been a betrayal. In a
Yeah.
way, yes. And also in the epilogue, which is still to come,
Mm.
you write that the holy and the sacred is the highest value, right?
Yeah.
The highest of values, and the huge, it's not even a paradox, the tragedy here is that, well, that's incomprehensible to the left hemisphere.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's like the tension is as strong as it can get here. We're going to talk about the highest value, and so that's going to be the most difficult thing to even talk about or even to comprehend.
Yes. Yes. And I think that that's been recognized in all wisdom traditions around the world and in all religions, that speaking explicitly is to miss the point. However, we've got to do something. And so I end up being rather apophatic, in other words, saying what is not the case rather than affirming what is the case, which also has an honourable history going back thousands of years. So, but I suppose when you start to look at what we're dealing with, you can see why in a left hemisphere orientated culture such as our own, the sacred would be incomprehensible. It has so many characteristics that do not lend itself to the left hemisphere's clear-cut, black and white, either or mode of operation.
Yes. But let me say that we've been preparing for this. I mean, we've been doing the McGilchrist yoga for 1,193 pages. And here we have another 111 pages for this chapter where, and you were talking about the melody and maybe the final chords that kind of complete it. Well, we've gone through neurology, to epistemology, to ontology, or metaphysics, and now theology. So we've been working through this, and at least I have, and I can see now some of the effects because I think I'm grasping some of what you're trying to articulate. So let me be positive in the sense that you're succeeding, I think, and we as readers can succeed if we've done all this work. I could feel it. Like, imagine, I mean, these 111 pages could be a standalone book.
Yes.
But who would understand it just starting straight away? I mean, we had to go through the lesser paradoxes of Zeno, then to the one on the many, through the hardcore time and consciousness. But for that, we had to go through the amazing cases of neurology and psychiatry. So it's been preparation to reach to that point and have make some sense of it.
Well, that's a very good point, really. It has been said to me, why don't you just publish this chapter, and not take it out of the book, obviously, but publish it separately as a book. And in the course of time, I don't know, maybe, but I think it would require, I think you're right, that it requires a reader to be prepared by what's gone before, which has nothing direct to say about the realm of the spiritual, but it's just alerting us to the importance of a way of thinking that is open to what appear to the left hemisphere to be contradictory propositions, so the coincidence of opposites.
Yes.
That we need to be open to things that can only be expressed implicitly, which has been, you know, a theme of mine all my life from the days when I was trying to talk about literature. That in fact everything that matters to us needs to remain in an implicit realm, because if you make it explicit, it just falls apart. And it's not that, as where the bright light of intellect is focused on it and it shatters it. It's not that, as it were, the thing itself fails the test of the left hemisphere. It's that the left hemisphere fails the test of the beauty and richness and meaning of art in all its forms, of music, of poetry, of love, and of the divine. All these things are real, but not measurable, not effectively analyzable in an explicit way. But it doesn't mean they're not real. And when you get to 20th century physics, you find Niels Bohr saying things like, we now know that in talking about the world of physics, we can use language only in the sense of poetry. And this doesn't mean, however, at all that it's not real. We have to use this language because it's the only way to approach it. And he makes explicitly the link between that and the way in which we need to approach the divine or the sacred. Yeah.
Plus, this chapter and the whole book posed a hard challenge to your whole thesis by the very fact of articulating it. Like you write in this chapter, you make it explicit for the first time, and it made me smile. You say, well, you all know, readers, that the writer of this book is someone whose left hemisphere is far from inactive. Because this could be the great tragedy. This could have been, I don't think it is, the great tragedy of the matter with things, that in trying to put forth this, And of course, using the big muscle of the left hemisphere, it remains a left hemisphere approach. So in a way, I see you as walking through this, thin line, trying to accomplish something very difficult.
Yes, yes. Well, all of that is right. Perhaps we should then do the best we can without being the subject to talk about it.
Yes. So let me ask you. Okay, let's start with it's a curiosity, but we'll see it unfold. Why did you entitle it "The Sense of the Sacred" as opposed to "The Sacred" without the sense, or straight away God?
Yes, I think you've touched on something very, very good there that I hadn't thought about. I certainly didn't want to call it God, because I actually say to the reader, you will have all kinds of unhelpful baggage attached to this word God, which might actually obscure the reality, the very important reality that this word that helps to obscure rather than reveal. And that when we think we've got a word for it, we've then really in the world of, right, I've got it now, I've pinned it down, it's God, and God is like this, and God does this and that and the other. And I'm trying to go back behind that and say, let's see whether we need the idea of God as we move forward. And I say to the reader near the beginning of this chapter, if the word God can be rehabilitated, then, fine, but we need first of all to do some work. Right. And the other point that I think you put your finger on that I hadn't really thought about is why the phrase "the sense of the sacred" seems so important to me. And it's partly because if I'd entitled it "The Sacred," I'd immediately be in the realm of the left hemisphere talking shop, So what concepts can we bring to bear on this? How can we analyze what is meant by the sacred and so on? And I wanted to suggest right from the outset that this is something of which we sense the reality without necessarily having the words or the concepts at hand with which to elucidate what it is that we're sensing. Mm-hmm. So all the time, what's going on in this realm is something, again, that we've talked about over the years, as it seems, actually less than a year, but never mind. It's the fact that there is a coming together of something in here with something out there that isn't graspable, but which sets up a resonance. So there is undoubtedly, for me, a sense of something that I it's there, it's real, and it evokes something in me, and I find that there is this reciprocal, reverberative relationship, this encounter. And for me, the sense of the sacred is something that we edge our way towards with appropriate seriousness and reverence towards something that is important and, as I say, not catchable and graspable. I quote at the beginning of the chapter a number of rather wonderful sayings, but one of them is from the author of The Cloud of Unknowing, the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing, a medieval English text, who says something like, by the intellect he cannot be grasped, only by love. I can't remember the words, but yes.
Yes. Should I read it? By love he can be caught and held, but by thinking, never.
That's it.
Yes.
That's it. Yes. So, but what I'm very, very keen to get away from is the idea that this means we're in a sort of woolly, soft state. First of all, the things I'm talking about are not necessarily comfortable. They carry with them some quite important, in some senses, disturbing thoughts. And the reason it's a long chapter is that I do engage with the topic intellectually as well, but all the time, as it were, doing what poetry does, which is to work with language to undermine the tendencies of language to pin things down. So I engage with sacred texts from many different traditions, but I find no great conflict here in them. And one thing I just received actually a very helpful critique from a highly intelligent reader who is in fact quite clearly a fairly committed Christian. And he was saying, this book is marvelous, but at the end you sort of leave a Christ-shaped hole in the picture. And of course, if you are a very committed Christian, then you may see that somehow there's a failure here for me to have taken that on board. But it's partly it's a reflection of two things that I don't. One is that I don't want to suggest, because I think it's false, that there is one way to see God, one way to understand God. I believe there are many ways, and there have been many very brilliant, wise paths beaten by people in many cultures across the world towards what everyone is struggling to express, knows is there, but finds difficult to express. And the other thing was that I felt that if anything, although it is a very intellectually demanding chapter, it has to be also an expression, a very honest and personal expression. Coming back to this idea of the sense of the sacred, we can't get away from the individual and the embodiment of the consciousness that is trying to reach whatever this is. And so I wanted to be true to my own feelings about it. I find the Christian mythos incredibly rich and have done all my life. Though, as I confess in the book, my family were not religious at all. In fact, rather the opposite. But nonetheless, I found that it is something that does speak to me, but it has never spoken to me with, right, that's 100% certain, and this is what you believe. In fact, I think that whole attitude is worryingly close to a kind of fundamentalism that the left hemisphere tries to impose. And as you know, in the book, in that chapter, I do deal with the fundamentalist theists and the atheists. And suggest that they show many of the same tendencies.
Well, you don't shy away to say what you think, and you think. And these two things are not to be taken for granted. I mean, my own opinion, if that counts, is that I think you do service to religion in this chapter, and you do service to Christianity, but you also more than touch, you engage with Kabbalah and with other mystical traditions, and that makes it richer. So one can see where you're coming from in terms of a tradition, and you honor it. At the same time, it's not like the typical, let's call it like Western-centric way of talking about God. So to me, that's some added value, not even added, like very, very special value in trying to talk about the sense of the sacred.
Yes, yes. That's right, and I do draw on a range of traditions, so that I talk about the pre-Christian logos, I talk about the Chinese li, about the Sanskrit ta, about Brahman, about all these different aspects, including of course Allah, Yahweh, and God. But I think that the commonalities of experience are more important than the distinctions that can be made.
Yeah. And with respect to the intellectual work, it also evoked in me this image of a high-performing athlete or dancer who's doing it at the very limits of his or her capacity. And it's like going to a really good circus in a way. And everything is in this state of tension where everything could go wrong if one misstep takes place, but it's where you can see the intellect doing in a way as best as it can, which by the way is the main theme of your whole book, because it's like and you another thing you do here, by the way, is you honor the left hemisphere in a way that I haven't seen done explicitly in the previous chapters, because you say what happens with it, but also that you have a section, we'll reach to it now if we ever start discussing the chapter, where you say, well, bring it back when you write about theology. So it's this expression of what it can do, and then what it cannot do, both at the same time.
Exactly. And so I think that, as always, it's a mistake to think that I'm discarding the left hemisphere or dismissing it. The only thing I'm discarding or dismissing is its claim to know it all and to be the boss, which it isn't. but it's a very, very helpful servant. And so what I show in this chapter is exactly the process, I believe, whereby we come to know anything, that effectively the right hemisphere has a precognitive take on it, which then the left hemisphere works on and unpacks and helpfully kind of debates about. And then that needs to be concluded and taken back by the right hemisphere into a now enriched whole. And I don't know where I'm going with this because there's so much to cover. But Nicholas of Cusa, I mentioned, this 15th century polymath who was a scientist and a mathematician as well as a theologian of great distinction, who had this idea that what is implicit is made explicit, explicatio. This is unfolding, literally. Plicare is to fold. So the unfolding of what is potential in the cosmos into the actualities that are precipitated out into the world, the phenomenal world we recognize. And then what he calls complicatio, which is not complication, but it's a re-embracing. Com is together, folding together again inside the divine. Because he sees, as I do, and so many of the figures I quote are getting at this in different ways, that a panentheistic vision is the important thing. And perhaps I should just unpack that a little. People may be familiar with the idea of pantheism, but not perhaps with panentheism. Pantheism is the belief that, as it were, all things are God, and God is the sum of all things, which is a straightforward idea that the left hemisphere can get hold of. So I see, so it's just everything. But that doesn't take us anywhere out of or beyond the things that I'm trying to get us beyond. There's a matter with things, I believe, and we need to get beyond that heap of things. And the idea of panentheism is that God includes all those things that are in pantheism, but goes beyond. So it's not just an immanent God, but a transcendent God as well. And this God needs, very importantly, to be both transcendent and immanent, to hold those two poles yet again, without allowing them to collapse into just one or the other. And it's in the tension that it lies. So the idea of panentheism is that God is in all things and all things are in God, but the sum of all things doesn't exhaust the infinite nature of God.
Yes. And we'll get there. Let me just say one more thing and we really get in. Another thing about how you exercise and treat yourself, the left hemisphere here, is like, well, you call it the hemisphere, but I think even his role has been upgraded because sometimes it feels like the hand of the king or the hand of the queen here. Not so, it's not the master, but well, because these are hard things to talk about and write about. And how could you do it if it wasn't thanks to the left hemisphere in a way? And so in this chapter particularly, I don't see him so much as the kind of the poor man trying to feel itself like he knows everything, but actually performing it, like especially when you talk about theology, a really incredible work, like something like when you would clap and they would say, and please now time to go, but there's a huge clap that one can even hear as one reads the many difficult passages in this chapter. And so with this, from ontology to theology, so you start talking about so let's get into the chapter after 30 minutes. You start talking about the ground of being, right? So you get us into the sense of the sacred, I would say, from ontology.
Yes.
Why is there something rather than nothing?
That's
the initial question you pose here.
Yes, I think it's a very important question, and a typical left hemisphere reflex exhibited by many Anglo-American analytic philosophers is this question does not compute. It's therefore a non-question. But that we should be wary of that intellectual reflex, because there is still, however you look at it, there is something wondrous about the very fact of being at all, of the being anything. And this has been reflected on by so many people, going back to Plato and Aristotle and, forward to Goethe and Heidegger and so on, that philosophy begins in awe and ends in awe, that there is something here that cannot be accounted for. And I quote quite a bit from Wittgenstein at the outset here, because he's very clear about this, that there is a problem here. But the thing is that the ground of being is, to posit a ground of being is not to answer a question. So it's not to say, oh, good, we've got a ground of being then. That sorted that out. Now we can move on to the next problem or question. But that's not at all the way in which it works. First of all, I think it's important to make a distinction between the idea of the ground of being as the left hemisphere would see it, because it sees everything as a chain of causation in which, as it were, an engineer makes a machine and gets it going. What we're referring to is certainly not the first temporal step in a process. We're talking about what, for all time, underwrites that process. So it's not on the same level as other things in the world. It's not something like a machine, but just much bigger and better than a machine. It's what underlies the very possibility of having a machine, or having laws that might govern the way the machine works. In other words, what grounds this ontologically, not initiates it temporally. Not a God who switches the dishwasher on and then goes and watches TV, but a God who is always there, underwriting the capacity, the possibility for the being at all. I think I quote Herbert McCabe, who's very good on this. He says that to talk about the ground of being is not to answer a question, but point to a mystery. And I think that is the ideal thing here. What may be very difficult for people, again, because of the culture we live in, is this sense that it's very important to hold on to things and not dismiss them just because they're hard to talk about or don't resolve easily into language. And an idea that's quite familiar here, but is worth mentioning, is that of, and we've probably mentioned it before, I have, Keats's idea of negative capability, that what a great artist does is to remain in doubts and uncertainties without irritably reaching after fact and reason, he says. So that if you apply, as it were, left hemisphere logic to a play by Shakespeare, you will miss the whole point of it. And the things that are not resolvable are the important things, not the things that can very easily be resolved. So I think we're in that terrain. Then I look at various ways of bypassing this, and like saying, well, the laws of nature will make the universe unfold anyway. But where do these laws of nature come from? Because they also need to be grounded. Also, laws make nothing happen. Laws are retrospective descriptions of regularities we perceive in the way things develop. They aren't things that make things happen. And, not only that, but you'd have to be still able to account for the initial conditions on which the laws are to operate. So attempts to dismiss the problem as a non-problem. I look at actually about half a dozen different gambits that have been tried on this one, and conclude that no, we need to remain with this concept. And the tendency then is, well, let's define exactly what it is. In fact, it may be more fruitful to use the concept or the word, whatever you like to call it, the logos, the li, whatever, or God, to leave it to unfold itself in the course of experience. It reminds me slightly of if you were learning a language without having a grammar and a dictionary to hand. So you go to a place in the world where we don't have the grammar and the dictionary. The only way you would be able to understand people would be to listen to them and engage with them, and then gradually you see, oh, that's what they mean by that word. Well, in a way, rather than start off with a prescription, you have to get in and find out. And I sometimes use the image of, the man who wants to learn to swim before he does the dangerous thing of getting into the water. Well, first I really need to know, can I swim? And what's it like to swim? And can I practice swimming before I get into the water? But it's actually only by getting into the water that you understand what swimming is and begin to practice it.
Yes, and this getting into the water, should we understand it? And I quote you here, right? The understanding here means never letting go of the questions, right?
Yeah.
So there's this impatience, which at the same time is a kind of laziness, right? Like, well, via negativa, but people conflate it with being pointless. Or at the beginning, we were saying, well, the sense of the sacred may be ungraspable, but that doesn't mean it's remote. But then what happens is that, well, as you write, if I cannot explain it, then there's nothing there to explain. So there's this refusal to engage at all levels. But here we're talking about the refusal to engage with the sacred, which is the greatest of tragedies. And you speak about that too, like the sequestration and marginalization of the sacred in our culture today because of this attitude.
Yes. Yeah. What we have to do is to, as it were, shake people's belief that they've already got it, and the sort of complacency that we understand things. And I suggest that in this area, not knowing and not having answers is a wiser thing than knowing and having answers. Knowing and having answers means you're worse off than somebody who recognizes there's something here but cannot answer the question. And I quote here this wonderful early 20th century mystic, Evelyn Underhill, who I like enormously. She wrote a book called Practical Mysticism, which brings together this lovely idea of the very down to earth, but nonetheless not letting go of this important concept of what cannot be easily contained within language. And she talks about how for modern man, the hair of reality is already jugged, and jugged hair is an English dish that is, I think it's equivalent of what the French call civet de lièvre, and no doubt you have something in Spanish equivalent, where you cook a hare in some of its own blood and so on. So the idea she was saying is that, it's no longer the glorious living animal, it's already prepared as a dish that can be eaten, and that you need to, she says, there's no question that there is this sense of complacency, and that we hang on to this rock of a reality we've created. And she says we must prise that barnacle off the rock so that it can actually see again what it is that it has mistakenly been clinging on to.
Now, this idea that we already got it, is it the same than thinking there's nothing to get? It sounds very similar. The moment you think we already got it, it is as if it's equivalent to saying, well, there's really nothing to get, and therefore we can just move on. Like there's no moving on. There's no moving on in this in this topic, right?
That's right. No. And actually, just not moving on from it, but staying with it, is a large part of the business of wisdom. Staying with it, not dismissing it, carrying it forward in your life. And there are ways in which that can be done, explicitly recruited if one wants to. But first of all, one needs to open oneself to the possibility of something. To say, oh, well, that's nonsense from the outset, is to have made an elementary error. Because, as I say, it's something that cannot be perceived until you've actually sincerely opened yourself to the possibility that this may be right. I'm not asking people to be gullible. In fact, I'm asking them not to be so gullible as to believe that their reason can just tell them this thing doesn't exist. I think that's a form of gullibility. And rather like schizophrenic subjects, a lot of the discourse of modern philosophy is so left hemisphere that it brings together a kind of unreasonable skepticism with an unreasonable gullibility. So a schizophrenic subject may be highly skeptical of ordinary things of everyday life that you must take for granted if you're going to function at all. but at the same time is ridiculously gullible about things that can't possibly be true. You know, like that there are Martians living in the garden shed or whatever it might be. So they lose the faculty to be skeptical about certain areas, but are over skeptical about things that, you know, we need actually to be able to accept that for most purposes there is a table here in this room. And so a lot of philosophy is like this, that and I think that the you know, the new atheists are a bit like this, that they strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. I mean, that's an expression, I think, from the Bible. But the idea is that they won't accept, for example, that the universe could be something ordered by a greater intelligence, which is really not a very difficult step to take. But instead, they would rather swallow the delusion that there are just an infinite number of universes, and so, of course, there's this one. And that seems to me a far more gullible position than the possibility that maybe there is intelligence in this cosmos.
Yes. And we've seen it in the studies of consciousness too, where illusionists or even materialists or physicalists can do very sophisticated reasoning, but it seems to us at least that they miss the fundamental point. It's again another tragedy. How clever, how stupid, you know, it's like, or maybe I'm stupid, I'm not getting why they're so stupid, but that seems to happen also in consciousness. Now, one question would be, well, why God? So we talked about the ground of being, but then maybe the left hemisphere question, well, what explanatory work does it do for us? Why God? And you're right that God is less an object of knowledge and more an object of awe. That's very interesting.
Yes, that's right. The more intelligent approach to God is to accept, as it were, that there is something here that is going to be very hard for our limited faculties to get to, but not impossible. So I'm not, I mean, of course, if there was absolutely nothing there to reach out to or to feel a resonance with, then that would be another matter. But I believe there is, and that if you stop irritably reaching after fact and reason and trying to reduce it to a set of explanations. I mean, God is not there as an explanation of something. God is not sort of wheeled in order to explain how certain things happen. God is, even if these things can be explained, there's still, I mean, God doesn't necessarily work irrationally. Why would God necessarily not work in ways that make sense in relation to the world? It doesn't exclude the idea of God. So once again, I think that we get further with this idea if we stop trying to, as I say, pin it down at the outset, but instead use it as what I call a placeholder, an unword. You know, as soon as you treat it as, oh, I see, so it's God, then it seems like you've pinned it down. You've got it, you've grasped it, the left hemisphere goes, fine, I've now got a whole drawer in my filing cabinet called God, that's fine, all this stuff can go in there. But I'm suggesting that this is the wrong way to think about what God is. And not an object of knowledge, certainly, but possibly the ground of knowledge, rather like the eye is not the object of sight, but the wherewithal for sight. That we don't see the eye, but through the eye we see. And so we don't situate God in the plane of things like the photocopier and the picture on the wall, another one of those, however magnificent and marvelous and, you know, unimaginably great, but something that is on a different plane altogether, that underwrites our capacity to know the world. And the knowledge of whom comes through kennen, not through wissen, through connaître, not through savoir. And what is it, connaître? No.
Sí, conocer, saber.
Saber, yes. Sí. So that contrast exists in almost every language except English, which is a great shame. And I think that it may explain many of the problems in Anglo-American analytic philosophy, is the difficulty of distinguishing between knowledge that comes by experience and knowledge that comes as a matter of facts.
Now here the word wonder and its polysemy is very interesting to me, because it is a disposition, and you're right after making this distinction between an object of knowledge and object of awe. You're right about disposition. So wonder is a disposition, but it also means a desire to know. So perhaps is the kind of knowing that needs to be evolved. It's not curiosity. It's not I want to figure things out. It's a very special kind of desire to know, wonder.
Yes, that's right. And Mary Midgley makes a marvelous distinction there between the idea of, which I wholly endorse, between the idea of curiosity as wanting to find out how this thing works, and wonder, which is a sense which we have to regain of quite how extraordinary every little living thing is. Whether it's she said, whether it's not even living. I mean, that this applies to our understanding of the cosmos, and it doesn't rule out that we can get to know in the sense of wissen and worked out the answers to questions we're curious to know the answer to. But there are certain things that don't respond to the idea, I'm curious about this. I'm curious to know what the meaning of life is. I'm curious to know the nature of God. This doesn't work. Nobody says that. These are not things that are resolvable to that kind of an explanation.
And this brings me to the part when you write about a disposition towards the divine, and you write suspending the left hemisphere. So maybe yours is a plea for a kind of left hemispheric epoche here, right?
Yes.
So it's like, please. And so, but then you say, well, it can do, so at some point it cannot do more for us, but at the same time you thank it. And that's, we don't need to read it, but I really enjoy this part. It's page, what do I have here? Yeah, 1208 probably. And it reminds me of the Lord of the Rings and Gollum. It's like, it's very important in the whole story. So I'm glad they didn't kick him off when he's in the cave at the beginning. They just let him be, and it's critical, but of course at some point you need to say thank you. So, well, I don't know if you share this analogy.
Do you want to, is the passage that you're referring to?
Yes, I could go and, let me go and find it out, because it's...
Is it something did you say 1208?
Yes. Yeah, just you write here. But here's the thing. Note that it is the left hemisphere and its reasoning processes that have brought us to this point, the point and at which its own limitations become evident. Put another way, the left hemisphere, as a servant, has provided a vital role, drawing attention to the limits of its service. And then you continue, right? So it reminds me of Gollum in The Lord of the Rings.
Yes, sorry, what was that last remark?
It reminded me of Gollum and Smeagol in The Lord of the Rings.
Yes, no, absolutely. That's right. That's an important thing. I don't actually, I think I do mention the Gollum in this chapter, but yes, the left hemisphere plays a part at one stage in this process and can be brought back in. When one comes to look at the structures of religions, because after all, the sense of the spiritual is not just something entirely personal. It has to be grounded in personal experience, but it's also something which becomes fulfilled when one realizes that it's part of a common feeling of other human beings. So the coming together that a religion brings about, and the word religion comes from religare, to bind. So it's this bringing together of people, and the nature of the rituals, the schools, the hospitals, the institutions that the church has founded, including scientific observatories and all that. This is all the unpacking by the left hemisphere of useful aspects of this essentially mysterious and mystical experience.
And that's the disposition. Tell us more about the idea of a disposition towards the divine. And you're right, it's not about an argument. It's again about the encounter. What's this disposition? That can be hard for people to really grasp what's meant, at least theoretically.
Well, first of all, what I mean by a disposition is that it's not a matter of propositions, which is the way in which philosophy deals with things. So it's not about saying, well, this is what you must believe, and then you have a creed. That is the left hemisphere setting to work. And as I say, as long as that is kept in its proper position, there's nothing wrong with it. But the disposition is something else, which is, you see, when one talks about truth, and I'm sure we've discussed this, you can either see it as a matter of laying down a fact and then another fact and another fact, or you can see it from its etymological source, that it's a matter of fidelity. It's a matter of being true to something. And one of the reasons I found this chapter very difficult to write was that I didn't want to be untrue to something so rich, so valuable, and so important. I didn't want to obscure it any more than it has already been obscured. I didn't want to besmirch it in any way. I wanted to help uncover it and enable people to literally discover again something that has been covered over by the accretion of creeds. So a creed has a place, yes, but it's more about a disposition. And what is that disposition? I think that disposition is, first of all, one of openness, which requires a sense of vulnerability, which is something we absolutely try to avoid at all costs in modern life. The one thing we can't accept is the risky or the uncertain. We want everything pinned down. Now, what I'm saying is that in this area, if that's your attitude, you will never get anywhere. But it's also not a matter of just, as it were, letting everything go. As I say, there is a state of mind, which is the one that I call active passivity. And I think I'm right in saying that I quote Freya Stark as using the phrase fearless attention or fearless passivity. So in other words, not being frightened, to open yourself to what is there. And I like here this image that really comes from George Steiner of the ear listening for something. So it's like you're trying to hear that somebody is coming and you're listening for the sounds. And at that moment, your senses are on the stretch. You're in the opposite of a passively kind of dozy, lazy position. You're in an acutely aware position in which you are, your senses are, as it were, stretched to the maximum to pick up what is there. And so you need that disposition of active passivity, of trust that there must be something there. Now, I sometimes talk about a leap of faith, but this is a very bad expression because what I'm talking about is nothing as random or as precarious as a leap. I'm talking about simply allowing, the image I use is that of somebody fording a stream and putting a foot on a stone and somebody on the other bank reaching out a hand and taking your hand. So you have to trust for a moment, but you take that hand, and that is not a blind risk-taking. That is a perfectly reasonable, in fact, it would be irrational not to accept that moment of uncertainty. So you need that. You need humility and compassion. These are probably the three most important aspects of this disposition. So not to rid yourself, but in fact to cultivate the sense of wonder, which is that freshness that the right hemisphere gives to experience before it's made it, it's one of those again, a familiar experience, and put it into the box. So it's that openness that enables awe and wonder. It's the humility to accept that one doesn't know everything, either in relation to the divine or to life in general, that one can only do the best one can. And to have a sense of compassion towards the world, to all things, and to people who differ from you.
And these, for those who are seeking for bullet point solutions, these are not, but this is as close as we can get to, well, then how do I do it, right? Like, okay, how do I do it? Well, cultivate those. And actually, it's really at the very end of this long chapter when you mention Homo sapiens and Homo coming from humus, and also humility, and the idea that we're made of dust and earth, and we'll come back to the earth. And you write about death and dying too. well, so it reminds me like this could be the if people want to take home, well, cultivate those and see what happens.
Yes, yes, and the name Adam, I think, is also means something like red earth. I think that's its origin in Hebrew. So we're made out of the earth, and we should remind us. That's of course what mortality means. We are these creatures that are limited, finite, bounded in time and space, and we are mortal beings, and that is not something to be lamented. That is something to be celebrated and responded to. And all I can say about life is that it's not about necessarily doing this, that, or the other, but it's having been open to and responded to whatever is there. Because if you do make yourself open to it, then you will be rewarded. Something will come to you. This is not the same as saying there is a God who will order everything right for you in your life. I mean, really, it's not right.
Yeah.
This is not a promise made by any kind of religion. And Sir Francis says, when you pray, you should pray for nothing, absolutely nothing. So your prayer should be a response. And of course, there is a very famous canticle of St. Francis, which is really about the awe-inspired celebration of everything, of the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth, the water, and all the flowers and the trees, and so on.
Yes.
So that is a different way of expressing this idea of responsiveness. Anyway, yes.
Well, no, that helps me bring in a question and a comment. I wanted to ask you about the secular as opposed to the sacred. What happened with that bifurcation, seems to me, and I went to check the etymology, right? Secular, it was used in Christian Latin to mean the world, as opposed to the church. Very interesting, as if they said, it reminds me of today, the laboratory, what happens in the lab and what happens in the real world. And because you just made this comment about, a prayer to the rivers and the flowers, well, you also mentioned animism, where people naturally sensed, again, that everything is ensouled, a very important word. So I wonder if animism was before this bifurcation between the sacred and the secular.
Yes, I think it's only really in modern Western culture that this divergence of the two has been so marked. And it's a sign that there is already something wrong, it seems to me. In most other cultures, this hard and fast distinction between the secular and the sacred would not be recognized. Because there is a sense in most people that the sacred is not something that is put on the fringes of life, like it takes place in a suburb on the edge of the city somewhere, but is shot through the whole of life, that all things are sacred. This is something that the English poet William Blake is actually at the center of his work, and fortunately he's a poet that is very widely read and honored even today. But really his whole work is to awaken people to the sense of the sacred in things. He's also well aware of the coincidence of opposites, that sometimes this is not comfortable. He's very open to the conjunction of opposites. In fact, he's so open to it that he himself said that he believed that even in heaven there must be sorrow as well as joy. We couldn't have just joy without sorrow. Yeah. But that would take us into another area, which maybe we want to go to, which is to do with how good and evil relate to one another. But when you were saying, so how do I'm not giving bullet points, that's true, but what are the things that in general at a sort of meta level one could espouse? Interestingly, they could be the values that come on the next tier below the holy in Max Scheler's pyramid of values, which I both include in The Master and His Emissary and again towards the very end in The Matter with Things. And just to refresh people's minds, he distinguished between 4 layers of values. At the bottom of this pyramid was the useful and the pleasurable. Then above it there came what he called the Lebenswerte, the values of life, by which he meant things like courage, honorability, faithfulness, magnanimity, generosity, things like this, that nowadays seem very old-fashioned. They seem like parts of a culture that we've jettisoned, and we're reaping the consequences of it, because these things actually were enormously important to the functioning of a society. Being as good as your word, having in you a degree of magnanimity and generosity to others, not simply using them for what purpose they can serve for you, which is, you know, the lower level, the one with the very base level of the pyramid. So that's the second level up, is the Lebenswerte, and then come die geistige Werte, which are the spiritual or intellectual values. The word Geist in German means both spirit and intellect. Here I would think they're primarily beauty, goodness, and truth, the things that I talked about in chapter 26 on the nature of value.
Yeah.
And then right at the top is Das Heilige, the holy. So what I suggest is that in our world, this pyramid has been inverted, so that the goal of everything is utility and pleasure, and that these other things are only useful in as much as they deceive poor fools into doing things that are pleasurable and useful for everybody else. But but this is, I think, to get things absolutely wrong. This is the left hemisphere's way of looking, because the left hemisphere's goal, its value, is utility, enabling us to grasp things and manipulate the world. But the right hemisphere is the one that is open to these other values. And so actually just making sure that in the world one appreciates beauty where one sees it, that one brings out and helps add to that beauty in any small way one can in the world, that one respects goodness in others and tries as far as one can to be guided by real moral values in what judgments one makes, and not, as so often seems to be the keynote now, either saying that truth doesn't exist because we made it up, or that truth is just something out there that only science can reveal, but instead suggesting that it is something very important without which we can't function either as human beings, as individuals, or as a human society. So re-engaging with those values in whatever ways occur to you in your daily life would be one way of serving that highest value of all, which is the sacred, which requires these other things to be there as well.
Now we're gonna bring back the left hemisphere as one of the subsections of this chapter reads. But I wanted to ask you before that, and we've mentioned that you write, well, my readers know that I'm not a person whose left hemisphere is far from inactive. But then you do something you haven't done throughout the book, which is you said, well, I'm going to suspend the usual mode of discourse of the book. And you talk about yourself, your life. So why do you do this? Why do you do it there? And what are you doing when you're doing that at that particular moment?
Yes, good questions. Why do I do it, and why do I do it there? I think we come back to your insight that the title of the chapter, The Sense of the Sacred, is not just a chance formulation. It's a formulation that tries to get back to the concept of individual experience. And so I wanted to interrogate myself and be honest and open with the reader, because I think when it comes to this sort of thing, you are very much in an I-thou relationship with the reader, much more than in any other part of the book. Because I'm relying on an appeal to other people's experience from my own experience, and because I'm speaking, if I speak with any authority at all, here a lot with the authority of my experience, I thought it was important to have a look at it, partly for my own purposes, really, to lay it out, and to show the reader what I was thinking of, which was definitely not of a religion that says it's all written down in this book and you must never question anything that's in this book, and this book is the only book that has the answers to all our truths, and so on and so forth. Instead, I was responding to a deep sense that the world itself is sacred, which I have had since as far back as I can remember, really, which probably goes back to my late childhood, my early teens. And I think this was principally in the realm of nature. So the natural world called to me. And if you like, in an animistic way, as a child, I did feel that it was slightly strange to have to treat everything as though it was just a thing, you know, that all the bits around me in this world were just other things. But then there was this special thing humans could do, with have consciousness and so on. I didn't really buy that one, and I as you know, I certainly don't buy it now. So it was partly that, and partly a response to particularly music. So there is a whole range of music, and I particularly associate it in the West with the Renaissance, so the polyphony of the Renaissance. So I'm talking here about Byrd and Tallis and Palestrina, Lassus, other figures of that era. And their music seems to me not summarizable as either just intellectual or just emotional. It seems to me to be spiritual. It has a profound effect. And I felt myself very clearly experiencing something that vivified this part of me, which I think I can, you know, say is the spirit or the soul in me and in others. So it was that, and, you know, sacred art, visual art and poetry. And it was going to places, particularly in France, Italy and Spain, pilgrimage churches to places of great beauty where people had worshipped. And these things can't be underestimated. I mean, they really were mind-blowing to me, to go to, you know, Assisi, to go to Santiago de Compostela, to go to the wonderful pilgrimage churches of Conques and Moissac in France, and all the wonderful Romanesque and early Gothic world of Europe. So all of this spoke to me, and reading Dante and so on. I mean, definitely there is something here that cannot be just, we can't say, oh, well, now we know enough to dismiss all this. This is incredibly rich. And if you once stop talking, oh, I know it all, we're clever. If you just stop all that nonsense, which is really just a sign of how poor and feeble your intellect is, and just suspend it for a while and open yourself to something, perhaps that something will speak to you. I believe it certainly will speak to you. So that's really what I was doing there. I was saying this doesn't come from any kind of indoctrination. Absolutely not. It comes purely from experience and the beautiful rituals of church services, which I think are very moving. And I think ritual is important because it gives something, as it were, concrete, but not by being concrete pinnable down into, oh, I see, so that's that. As soon as you say that, you've made the difference between a sort of decodable symbol and a rich metaphor. So I believe that rituals are embodied metaphors. We use our whole body in carrying them out. We speak words. We change our bodily posture in all religious traditions, whatever it may be. So we are speaking with the whole person and embodying something that can't be just translated into an explanation. Oh, I see. You know, like when a red light comes on at the corner of the street, the car must stop. That's what a red light means. It's a symbol of a kind. These are not symbols of that kind. They're not decodable in that way. In fact, once they're decoded, they're no longer doing their work. Just as when I explain a poem by saying, this man is very sad because his wife has died, I really haven't helped understand the poem. In fact, I've got between the reading of the poem and the reality that the poem refers to.
Yes, and that's the service that the ritual does when it's proper and it's a right hemisphere. Now you contrast it or integrate it with the left hemisphere, which is theology. So let's go back to this. It's well important and interesting. So it's Panentheism, which in a way also integrates deism and theism. Yeah, explain that, please.
Yes. Integrate, did you say deism and theism?
Well, it transcends, like as we'll see, right?
Yes.
Continuing reading, it does what they both were trying to do but failing.
Yes. Well, as you know, I disapprove of and dissociate myself from deism, because deism is a term of art, isn't it, which refers to a very particular way of looking at the world, that popularized in the work of Paley, at least in the Anglophone world, who was a bishop at the time, who made the analogy: if I found a watch lying on the heath as I was walking across it, and I didn't know what it was, if I looked at it, I'd instantly think there must have been a watchmaker. And so he argues that there is something that made this from the complexity of the mechanism. But unfortunately, by doing that, he is evoking the very picture of God that I wish most strongly to dissociate myself from. A God who actually knows all the answers already, can do anything, and the world is a machine made by him, wound up by him, and then left to do whatever it is. And that is entirely misleading in my belief. So, but theism is a general term which can relate to any form of belief in a divine being. So I'm content to be called a theist, not content to be a deist. But I think what you're perhaps getting at there is, and that's a good point, is that this God must be, as I say, both transcendent and immanent, not in the world, but not summed up by the world, and able to be in the world without being in some way negated by that involvement with the world, but in fact fulfilled in that involvement with the world, which includes a kind of suffering. And in all religions, there is this idea of the divine essence somehow limiting itself. In Christianity, it's called kenosis, which literally means an emptying out. So the idea is that in the Christian mythos, that God limited himself and emptied out some aspects of his divinity in order to enter into the world. Well, as I say, there are different ways of thinking about what that means, and I'm not sure quite in which way I necessarily could be pinned down to believing it, but I do believe it's a very, very rich metaphor, and that whatever it is, I do believe is in the world, and is there to be seen if you put yourself in the way of seeing it. And here we come back to the idea of animism, because although I know this will appall theologians, what I think Panentheism, which is very much an intellectual construction and therefore an analytic propositional way of thinking about things, what it is getting at is the experience that in cultures other than the Western one is called animism. And the interesting thing is, animism is, just let me say this, not necessarily primitive. So we do associate it with ancient beliefs, or not beliefs, but ancient ways of being of indigenous peoples who have not been westernized or Christianized or whatever. But it is also an important part of highly educated Japanese thinking. So, a Japanese lawyer or doctor or whatever might nonetheless go to a place, to a temple, to address the spirit that is in the rocks, in the mountains, in the water, in the fields, whatever, in the trees. And this is very much the spirit actually of Wordsworth. Wordsworth doesn't talk about spirits being in these places, but he very, very clearly, I mean, the overarching expression in his poetry is this sense of the divine in all things, the spirit that he says that rolls through all things, and that is panentheism in a nutshell. But it is not the same as those all things, but it is rolling through them. I like the rolling because it is a matter of constantly flowing, and flow works well with panentheism because one of the images used by, I think, Rumi is that of water, and he expresses a kind of panentheism in his own Islamic context, when he says, whatever this divine thing is, it is the source, the spring of water. It is the water that flows forth from the spring, and it is the cup that brings the water to the mouth. So it is, and this is very much like an image that I remember being told by a very simple Franciscan friar when I was about 15 or 16, and it's always remained with me as a way of thinking of the Trinity, that God is like this. If you take a book, is the book the thing that was in the mind of the author? Or is the book this object on the table? Or is the book what happens in the mind of the reader? And the answer is it's all of these three things. None of them negates the others, but they all complement one another. There are different aspects of it. And so this is like the water spring, the water that flows, and the water that is taken in by the so this idea, which is essentially panentheistic, is a very good one, and it emphasizes this concept of flow, which is there in Zen Buddhism, is there in Taoism. Of course, it's the central image of Taoism. Is there in Meister Eckhart and the medieval mystics. I quote them, this idea of God as constantly creating, constantly flowing out, constantly going to meet the world and be in the world, and this close connection between God and the living soul. Meister Eckhart says in this very dramatic way, God so loves the soul that if someone could take away from God that soul, God would die. I mean, of course, he was a great orator. He was a great commander of attention. But it is a rather interesting concept. So really what I was going to do there was to just draw attention to the fact that a left hemisphere way of thinking about it, which is helpful, is to see it is panentheism, but it's also an expression of animism. And I just want to make one further comment, which is about the hemispheres here. So the right hemisphere is naturally more animistic, and the left hemisphere naturally the opposite. So when people have the right hemisphere experimentally suppressed, which you can do using transcranial magnetic stimulation, they naturally see things as tools offering service to them, but they don't see the living aspect of them. Right. And this is also reflected in a number of studies on where certain ideas, concepts, and words are in the brain. And tools and machines are in the left hemisphere. Living things are in both hemispheres, but they are more present to the right hemisphere. And contrarily, when you suppress for a while the left hemisphere, people say they see things as living. They see bread as alive. They see the sun as a living being that moves across the sky. Now, you may say, well, in that case, they're deluded. But I think there's also a delusion that nothing is living. And I think it's a very deep and complex thing. Which way is less dangerous to go on this? And as you know, I believe that animacy and inanimacy are not wholly separate one from another. So that what life does is to offer something extra. And I think we talked about this before, so I won't go there again now.
Well, wonderful for explaining what panentheism is and its relationship to animism in your view. Now, there's another idea, very powerful, when talking about God, which takes the processual nature of everything we've been discussing and you've been writing about in physics, in biology, literally flow, and so on, and in a way cranks the resonance up to the highest level, which is in this case talking about God. So you also introduce the readers. I mean, I knew process theology because I've been lucky enough to even visit Claremont, and I listened to John Cobb and David J. Griffin. But it's fascinating what this understanding of God offers, and you don't go into an exegesis of what there could be. You go into phrases of the Bible. I am who I am, and maybe a better translation, I will be who or that which I will be. And you also offer a few others which we can cover because they're very interesting, that in a way reveal most likely the processual nature of God.
Yes, you're right. Yes, that was a revelation to me to discover that the Hebrew words that God is supposed to have said to Moses, the most natural translation is not "I am that I am," but "I will be that which I will be." And that is an insight to the idea that God may actually be able to coincide two opposites here, becoming and being, because they're not really opposites to one another. But the point here is that I believe that, importantly, God is certainly becoming and doesn't know the answers, as it were, ahead of time. Remind me to come back to omniscience and omnipotence.
We won't miss it, for sure. We won't miss those two.
No. Okay. But I don't think that when God created, he sort of, as it were, wearily went to a cupboard and got down things he'd made. Here's one I made before, and opened them out, and oh yeah, that was that one, and this is it. So in a way, it was an experience of coming to know himself, itself, whatever. The cosmos, the divine cosmos, is coming to an ever moving understanding, a greater unfolding of what potential is in there, a precipitation of it out into actuality, which doesn't do anything to impair the integrity of that divine cosmos, but in fact fulfills it. So in seeing that process, it's interesting that the first account given of the creation, because there's more than one account in Genesis, but the first account has God say, after each day of creation, he looked and saw that it was good. Now, in other words, he didn't have to sort of just recognize, oh yeah, I made that, thumbs up, but he actually looked at it and saw that it was good. So that there was a recognition, not just there was a sort of sense of, I've taken in what this is and it is good. So it was a process. And then there are other things too. I've mentioned some things to do with the medieval mystics, but it's the same thing in other traditions. It's there in Schelling very much, and in Hegel, and in Wordsworth and Coleridge, and it's there in A.N. Whitehead. I very much appreciate Whitehead's work because, of course, he was a philosophical and mathematical genius. There's no question about it. He was the co-author with Bertrand Russell, after all, of the Principia Mathematica. But he is also so much more, I think, than Bertrand Russell, although there are little hints in Bertrand Russell that he actually saw something animate in the world that we think of as inanimate, but I'd use that as an aside. But Whitehead has this idea of the divine and the cosmos as being in a sort of co-creative dance, out of which the cosmos comes into being and God comes further into being through the response of that cosmos, and that cosmos comes further into being through the response of God. So each of them is fulfilling something that was only potential. And this suggests to me the idea of, in fact, a double helix, that there is a spiral here. I've talked enough about spirals before, how they combine the idea of the circular without reduction to you come back to where you were, you go somewhere else actually. So it is progressive, but at the same time circular. But this is like a double helix in which each one is dancing with the other and coming out to something greater. I've only just thought of it now, but of course that is an image that goes back well before the double helix goes back well before, of course, the discovery by Crick and Watson, because it was Mercury's staff that had the entwined serpents that form a double helix. So I think this idea, like so many ideas, has been there in ancient traditions before the modern one.
And even for the left hemisphere at its best, some of these ideas sound quite preposterous and even obscene for a theologist, like the idea that God creates the world, but also in a way that the world creates God. I mean, yes. This is quite radical to say.
I suppose what I'm saying is not that the world creates God, but I'm saying that God becomes more himself always through the process of his creation. And the creation obviously comes more itself through. I'm not saying that the creation makes God, because after all, the whole idea is that there has to be a ground of being here, and that ground of being is that God that is in this process. But the fact of God being the ground of being, and even being perhaps eternal and unchanging being, is not so far from the idea of processual theology as people might think. Because let us go for a second to Heraclitus here. So Heraclitus famously said, or is said to have said, because it's a report, everything flows. But what we know he definitely said is, or as definitely as we can know anything, you cannot step into the same stream twice. But what he was meaning there is that the stream is constantly there, but the stream is also flowing and changing. So it's not the same stream exactly. And also perhaps he was hinting at the fact that the person who is doing the stepping can never be the same person on another occasion, because we also are living streams. We have a form that largely remains but evolves, and the stuff in us is flowing through us all the time. So that idea is important, because he also says by changing it remains the same. And that's something I talk about at the beginning of chapter 12 on the science of life, because the very word metabolism means change, and yet metabolism is what enables us to persist in being. So like the stream that is always the stream, there's a stream that passes my house, it is always that stream, but it is always different water. So change can be the only consistent thing. Well, that's one way of putting it, is that the only thing that is persistent is change. But that doesn't mean that there's just randomness and chaos. There is order to this process. Now, what I'm trying to suggest there is that this idea of a process is not antipathetic to the more traditional vision, but is something that can be taken up into it. I don't pretend to be a radical theologian, but I think that I hope that people can see some value in these perceptions and perhaps take them in a more sophisticated way with their left hemisphere trained theological background into something.
Yes, and I, as I said at the beginning, I think you accomplished the job, because even when you write about perfection and also one could ask, and you quote, of course, different sources, well, what would that prototypical God with all its powers lack, if anything? And then you say, well, it would lack limitation and becoming. This is fantastic. I mean, so of course it or he or whatever it is doesn't lack them, and that's what in a way accommodates the processual view of God, that it decides to limit himself or itself so as to be more complete. It's very dialectical in a way too.
That is absolutely right. And interestingly, this so-called dialectical movement was not something invented in the 19th century by Hegel, but is there actually anciently in many cultures. And what you've reminded me of, and we mustn't forget to come back to omniscience and omnipotence, but is this absolutely amazing myth of creation in the Lurianic Kabbalah. The Kabbalah has been a body of mystical knowledge that is extremely ancient. And in the 17th century, somebody called Abraham Luria produced a synthesis of it, a body of it, which includes the following myth of creation. In the beginning, there was something called Ein Sof. And what Ein Sof means is no limitation, actually. It's very, very interesting. And it's sometimes just referred to as Ein, which means nothing, which is already a paradox. And when this God wanted to create, what did he do? Did he stretch out his hand and say, let there be an earth, let there be the seas, the skies, the mountains? No, his first act was negation. His first act of creation was to withdraw, to make room for something other than Ein Sof, because at that point Ein Sof was everything. So for there to be an other, and if everything is relational, as I believe it is, and if God is archetypally relational, and in many religions, not just the Christian religion, but for example in Buddhism, this ultimate principle is thought of as love. Love is a relation, and it can't help but have an other. There can be no love without an other, and that other, in order to respond to love, and love is nothing if it is not responded to, needs to be free. And so you get the problem of a creation that is free to respond or not to respond, and hence you get the possibility for there being a turning away, a seeking of individual power, what we call evil. But anyway, to continue with this story, that phase is called Tzimtzum, which really means withdrawal. And the next thing that happens is that in this space that has been made, there are, I think, a dozen vessels, and a single spark comes out of Ein Sof and falls on the vessels and shatters them. And this is called Sheferat HaKelim, meaning the shattering of the vessels. And the idea here seems to be that these vessels were to contain whatever it was that was the emanation from Ein Sof, but that the vessels were not able to contain such an incredibly powerful and life-giving energy. And so they were broken. And that's the second phase. And the third phase is called Tikkun, which means repair. And the idea here is that specifically humans, I think, in this tradition, but it could be all creation, has a role in recomposing these vessels. Our job is to take these fragments, which all contain a little spark of that original fire that came out of Ein Sof, and put them together to make vessels that are more beautiful even than the original vessels, which puts me in mind of this Japanese ceramic art called kintsugi, where a vessel can be, a broken vessel can appear more beautiful when it's repaired with gold. And or even it's not just the gold, it could be repaired without gold, but the lines can make it actually more beautiful. And certainly this art with gold makes the broken vessel repaired more beautiful than the original vessel. So why this story particularly resonates with me is that it seems to me to be an intuition of the way the hemispheres work in the bringing of anything into being. So first, the right hemisphere, as it were, empties itself out in the sense that it creates that state I've called active passivity or audition, in which it is looking out for something and waiting for something to come. And when it comes, it passes to the left hemisphere, which has all its categories, the vessels, and it tries to contain what this reality is in those vessels. But the vessels don't contain the reality. They're not sufficient. So in a way, the vessels declare their own insufficiency. That's fine, because that work has still created something which can then be taken back by the right hemisphere into a now enriched and more beautiful whole. It's like the piece of music, which, as I say, you initially take it in as a whole, you then break it up so that you can practice parts of it, but you then, when you give the performance, you forget that and you have a reintegrated whole which is greater. So that seems to me an amazing. I mean, I was utterly gobsmacked when I found out about it. I thought, good heavens, this is a perfect intuition of what I'm trying to express.
Well, thank you for saying this for two reasons. Why I was very moved right now as you were talking about loving and what it needs, and needing the other, and needing the other to be free. This is very moving to me. And the second thing, which is moving maybe in a more left hemisphere aspect, is this, because you alluded to it directly, and that's something I had here in my notes, because I think it kind of captures what could be called the McGilchrist dialectics of this whole book, which is, you write this in page 1229 for the readers if they want to go and enjoy it, because you make it explicit again. The initial presence in the right hemisphere, second step, then transfer to the left hemisphere, and then you write to gain expression and then representation. So it's like, fine, it's not like get out, no, okay, fine, express and represent, Then the third movement, returned to the right hemisphere. Again, like in the Lord of the Rings, the Return of the King. Well, return to the right hemisphere. But then you say, when it is recognized and subsumed into a new gestalt. That's fantastic.
Yes.
That's fantastic.
Well, yes, that is my belief about the way the brain deals with everything. The trouble is that if you're too locked into the left hemisphere's way of seeing things, the process stops halfway through with the left hemispheres having disassembled whatever it is. And this completely negates the wonder of the whole, the integrity of the whole, and one's sense of something much greater than this analysis that one's produced. So the analysis is not wrong, absolutely not. And the left hemisphere is a very useful servant. I don't think that I would be a better writer or expositor if I didn't have a left hemisphere. As I say in the book, I expect you picked up that my left hemisphere works overtime. But I hope that it works in sync with my right hemisphere. I do feel these two things in me all the time, talking to one another. And so, yeah, there are two other resonances with this image of right to left and right, and the Tzimtzum, the Shefrat HaKelim and Tikkun. And they are, again, I mentioned this earlier, Nicholas of Cusa's idea that first there is what is, which is implicate. It then undergoes explication in the explicatio in the left hemisphere, and then it is taken up into a greater whole in complicatio by the right hemisphere. And this is lovely. David Bohm, everybody knows his book, The Implicate Order, but the idea there is that what is implicate is made explicate. But what people often don't refer to is that he also says that it is then re-enfolded into a new whole. So there are strains in ancient Middle Eastern mysticism, in physics, in philosophy, in neuroscience of the way the brain works, which image one another in a very beautiful way.
Yes. And to continue with this, and back to the scriptures, the Bible, you could call attention to the kind of power that God may have. This is also beautiful. Let there be light. It's not here, I, divine ruler, compel. No, it's let there be light. And you write this idea of power as permissive, which has a lot to do with love. And also has resonances. This is, again, to me, a higher level, perhaps the highest level resonance of when we spoke about the brain as permissive and all of that. So tell us about the idea of power as permissive in God.
Okay. Well, it goes hand in hand with his other common attribute of omniscience. I mean, I've already said that I don't think that God knows it all in the sense that it's all a sort of finished matter. The conclusion is already known and everything is the way it is because God already knows it. This is the left hemisphere's idea of knowledge, which is a bunch of facts that I can state now. And it may be very true that God knows, as it were, where this will end, but not the detail of the intervening steps that will take us from there to that end. In this, it may be like a wise physician who is often able to see where this particular condition is progressing to, and may be able to say the steps that need to be taken now, but can't actually say what particular course and how it will unfold itself, but one knows what the end of it will be. So I believe that God may have two kinds of knowledge. One is this overarching sense of the way the thing will go, and that may be certain, because I believe that in the end, good has the capacity to accept evil where evil doesn't have the capacity to accept good. And in the end, that is the reason that good will triumph, because it is more capacious. It can always take into itself the hatred of evil and accept it, whereas the hating evil cannot take into itself the goodness of acceptance. And so they're asymmetrical as always. But anyway, that's, sorry, I must stick to the...
But if you wish, no, but wait, look, that's good because as you were mentioning, let's postpone this for a minute. As you were mentioning loving and the need for the other and to make it free, I wanted to ask you about the problem of evil, because this is, the hard problem of consciousness for neuroscientists, whatever. Evil is the hard problem of theology. Yes. So maybe you can now refer to it.
Well, I think maybe if it's all right with you, I'll talk about the omniscience and omnipotence, and then we'll come to the evil, if that's okay.
Yes, of course.
So, the other way in which to think of God's knowing is that it is canon, it's not wissen. So that God knows, recognizes, and through that recognition brings further into being the things, the creatures, the whole. But this is a sort of right hemisphere knowing, not a left hemisphere knowing the facts kind of thing. And the idea of omnipotence is, the left hemisphere's idea is the ability to control and to interfere in something in order to produce a certain outcome. And that is one kind of omnipotence. But like this all-knowing omniscience of the left hemisphere, I don't think God has that kind of omnipotence. And when I say God is not omniscient and not omnipotent, because this can't be recognized or reconciled with, reconciled with the problem of evil. How can God be omnipotent and omniscient and still allow, suffering and evil? And I say, well, I rather than deny the existence of evil, which I think I have experience of, I would deny that God is necessarily omnipotent and omniscient, but I'd also immediately need to qualify that by saying that God is not omniscient and not omnipotent. Yes. Because the terms are wrong. It's like God is not green, but then God is not green either, because the term is just wrong in this circumstance. So the way we think of omniscience and omnipotence is to limit God to a certain way of being, which is not the way that God is. So that instead, God's power is the underwriting of the potential for everything to happen. And it is permissive power. And I tell the story of the Tibetan Buddhist monk in a monastery when the Chinese moved into Tibet in the last century and destroyed many of the monasteries and turned the monks out. The monk just continued praying as the soldier told the monks to leave. And the soldier came up to him and roughly pushed him with the butt of his rifle and said, "Don't you know I have the power to kill you?" And he said, "Don't you know I have the power to let you?" Which is not just a kind of sophistical message. It is a very important thing that it reframes what is happening here. So I believe God creates through permission, not through a fiat. This is what will happen. Because that would reduce creation to a plaything. It would reduce all of us to being robots, tools of God in this mechanism that he set up, and he knows where it's going, in which case why bother with it really? It's a process of discovery that is magical, wonderful, creative, not just I come back to Bergson's image of it's a painting that's coming into being, but it's not like a painting on a lady's fan where it's all closed and then you open it and there it is. Nothing has changed. But this is not the way this thing is happening, in my view. Now, to come to the issue of evil, I mean, there have been ways of dealing with this. And in one mainstream tradition that includes Plotinus, but also sort of mainstream Christian apologists, evil is sometimes cast as a mere absence of good. And this seems to me entirely unsatisfactory. Again, the ultimate test of any of these things is that it must It must be true to one's experience. One mustn't fudge things away in which one wished they might be and try and save the system one has got. That's what the left hemisphere does. It doesn't want to alter its system. It wants to say, well, we can never mind about that because it's really just an absence of good. Because first of all, that raises a logical question. If God is this omnipotent, omniscient in the conventional sense, God, why does he have to allow this to happen? I mean, what compulsion is he under to allow this evil to be? Unless the creation is free. And if the creation is free, there isn't a problem because that free creation can respond wholly, beautifully, fully, or it can turn away. And that turning away is evil. So I suggest that just as I appeal to my experience, that I feel there is something sacred, my experience tells me that there is something, I don't shy from the word evil, in the world, that is not just a negative, it's not just a failing of something, it's actually something that has its own drive, its own power, its own desire to destroy. I think anybody who's done even a little forensic psychiatry will have met people who, I'm sorry, it doesn't sit well with our modern humanist way of thinking, and not necessarily to be dismissed as evil people, but certainly do evil deeds and seem to be possessed by a desire to do evil simply for the sake of doing it. Hannah Arendt said that evil arises when people wish to do something, not because it produces a favorable outcome for them, but just for the sheer hell of it, in a way, not an unapt expression, the hell of it, that, you know, that to make something happen because it can be done. So it's an expression of this will to power, which again is left hemispheric. And this cannot be denied in my view, or it's unsatisfactory to deny it. And so one then comes back to, I think, the perfectly reasonable idea that it is a consequence of a certain vulnerability. And this vulnerability is not shied away from in mainstream Christian mythology. I mean, for example, one of the most famous poems in the English language is Milton's Paradise Lost. And the story of Paradise Lost is of a God who makes himself vulnerable. He appoints this brightest and best of his angels, Lucifer, the light bringer, and that Lucifer uses his power out of envy for the power of God to rival God, to try and destroy his creation. And that is utterly comprehensible to me. I see it enacted in the world. Yeah. So that's the way I deal with evil. I mean, I would remind people, if they're Christians, that in the Lord's Prayer, Christ doesn't ask for us to be just a little bit better than we might otherwise have been. He says, deliver us from evil. And he himself, according to the stories that are incorporated into the New Testament, I have nothing to say about their factual truth, but at least it's mainstream that he was tempted by the devil. And that there is a devil and that there is a hell, because in the mainstream Christian belief right there in the creed is he descended into hell. Well, what's hell doing in this benign cosmos? Yeah. So I believe, not in a Zoroastrian way, that there are simply these two powers that vie with one another eternally, but there are two entities that are ultimately resoluble in a conjunctio oppositorum, but are nonetheless opposed. And what we mustn't do, once again, in holding this tension between them, is to collapse it by saying one or other of these can't be right. Either there can't be a good God because there's evil, or there can't be evil because there's a good God. I think the solution is not, I'm not holding myself up as somehow being able to solve a problem that many minds greater than mine have, sweated blood over. But all I'm really saying is that I think a reasonable way for me to understand it is that, as I say, like so many things, there is a pairing and one of them can contain the other. So one of the ones I use is asymmetry and symmetry. Asymmetry is greater than symmetry because asymmetry can accept symmetry. Symmetry can't accept asymmetry. And if people want a visual example of this, they need to just look at the plates, the end of the plates in volume 2, where I juxtapose a facade of a villa by Palladio in the 16th century and the 18th century Enlightenment version of it, very beautiful in its own way, which is entirely symmetrical, and show how the one can accept asymmetry, the other one can't accept. Asymmetry can accept symmetry, but symmetry can't accept asymmetry. And you know, this is also consonant with scientists such as Pasteur, a biologist, and Pierre Curie, a physicist, who both of them said, and obviously, I say obviously, but I don't think they were echoing one another, but they both say the important thing in the world is asymmetry. There may be symmetry, but that's not really important. What's important is the existence of asymmetry. And of course, asymmetry in itself implies symmetry. Something that is asymmetrical has to have a hint of symmetry, otherwise one would just call it a mess. One wouldn't say it was asymmetrical if it's just chaos. So there is a tension between these terms, but one of them is greater than the other. And it's like the relationship between the hemispheres. The right hemisphere certainly can accept and use what the left hemisphere knows, but the left hemisphere can't accept, doesn't understand, and doesn't know what the right hemisphere knows. So it's always important that one of this pair is ultimately the one that is the master. And in this case, it's good, not evil. It's the triumph of love over hate.
Yes. And I hope your readers and listeners can now see how this chapter attempts and offers a kind of an apotheosis of understanding in many ways, because here we see again, but again at this highest level, how and why God is the coincidence of opposites. And you're right, unity and multiplicity are finally reconciled in God, and also that Panentheism now can be understood as the union of transcendence with immanence. I mean, this is hardcore, or basically the kind of the motto could be, and you write that too, of course, that the union of division with union. So this is the constant alchemy going on, but now the heat is high while talking about these matters.
That's right. And it is that at one level there is an opposition, but at a higher level, one of them always trumps the other. This is a point William James himself made. And he introduces I can't now remember the passage, but it's in that chapter, I think, where I quote James as saying, you know, if I have to say from my own experience what there is, it seems to me that there are these competing forces for division and union, but one of them is always greater than the other and can take the other principle up into itself, is more creative. And, you know, he uses the image of the islands that appear above the water as separate, but are ultimately connected at the base.
Now, let me just emphasize that in this chapter, in a few pages, you make two moves that, you know, if I was watching a sport, I'm sorry for the comparison, we should need to pause, rewind, and watch it slow motion, and then pause and rewind, because you explain how you think and others that God is not the Almighty or the All-Knowing. So that should be paused to see that move. But then you complete that again in this dialectical movement, saying, but God is not almighty and not all-knowing. And these are two, they come close together in pages, but wow, we should pause here.
Well, I think it illustrates this very, very, very important insight that negation is part of creation, which also explains the necessity for constant birth and renewal and death, and you know, that these processes feed one another. And negation in the form of resistance, or, you know, just as a way of reaching the ultimate reality, is so important, particularly, of course, in Eastern traditions, where there is an unknowing, which is not the same as ignorance, but is what is achieved after we've left knowledge behind. It's not what you have before you know, but what you have after you know. And I think that is a very lovely idea. And a true one, and that, of course, negation, unlike acceptance can accept negation, but if negation negates acceptance, that's fine, but it must also negate negation. And in negating negation, you know, if evil is, as Goethe says, Mephistopheles is that which always verneint, that always says no, that always negates. Then if it really always negates, then it negates negation as well. So it becomes part of creation. Whereas the spirit that says yes doesn't, it may, by saying yes to negation, produce the problem of evil as we've described, but its yesness includes the knownness. I have somewhere on my computer, and I once delivered it in a lecture, a sculpture by, I think, a Swiss sculptor, which is absolutely amazing. You look at it and it just looks like the word no. It's a metal thing and it just looks like no, and the camera pans round and it transforms itself into yes. I don't know if I refer to it in the book. I should have done if I'd been thinking. But anyway, it's a wonderful image. Anyway, yes, resistance is an important part of every kind of creation. And some people get tired of what they call the apophatic approach, and they're much keener to say things positively all the time. We can be certain that. This is an aspect in a certain kind of religion that borders on fundamentalism, where there just are truths and they're revealed to those who are the chosen ones, who lucky enough to have these things revealed to them. I find this, well, it doesn't answer to my experience, let me put it that way. And I don't say that it isn't a true experience for other people, but it doesn't help. It certainly doesn't help other people come to see how, without being unreasonable, they can open themselves to what I want in this chapter is to open to reasonable-minded people who accept science, who accept reason, that there's nothing there that tells them that they can't accept the existence of the sacred. In fact, all these paths that we followed in the book, those of the neuroscience of the brain, physics and philosophy, lead to an acceptance of this possibility, not a certainty of it, because that's not really part of what there is, but at least to be open to the certainty and uncertainty, or the possibility. And if you're open to that potential, all you need is to open yourself to that potential, and then you will see what it is that you can't see until you do open yourself to it, and then that something will grow in you.
Yes, and it's been growing. Now, talking again, let's dwell a bit on negating negation, because we started with the ground of being, but now when you write about negating negation, you write about the unground, which to me, in a way, helps to do that alchemy again on where we started.
Yes, that's right. Well, the Ungrund is an expression of Burma in the 18th century, I think. Yes, mystic and philosopher. And I think it's a good expression because it conceals within itself that what it is talking about is not a ground in any common sense of that word. As I said at the beginning, we really need an unword for this thing, a word that doesn't work as, we've got it defined and it's in the dictionary, but a word that, as I say, is a placeholder for something to come into being. You know, it's like, let's make room in this picture for something that we know about, but we can't actually talk about very much at the moment. If you don't make a place for it, it seems not to exist anymore. It simply stops referring to it. So we need this concept. And, you know, Heidegger has been much mocked for a saying, which I think is completely misunderstood. What he said was, das Nichts selbst nichtet, which literally means the nothing nuffs itself. I mean, there isn't a verb in English for that. So if nothing goes around nothing all the time, then what it does is it nuffs. And there wasn't a verb in German, nichten, either, when he said das nicht nichtet. But what he's drawing attention to is that this urge, which is the opposite, apparently, of the creative urge, also one of its great features is to enable itself to be a part of a world in which things do come into being. And so I have quite a long note on that in the book. The difficulty is, of course, Alex, as you know, it took me a year to write about these things in a way that I felt was satisfactory, and it involved many changes of expression. And so it's very difficult for me now to talk about these things without making the errors that I wanted to avoid.
Well, let me add because it's something I wanted to say before. I'm glad you didn't do like Aquinas, who stopped writing it in the middle of it. Can you imagine the last chapter of The Matter with Things, like you mentioned Aquinas in the Summa? Okay, I quit. So you went through.
Should I explain that? I mean, that Aquinas was, by common consent, the greatest ever Christian theologian, who wrote this massive Summa Theologiae in the 13th century. And he's commonly spoken of in the same breath with Plato and Aristotle. Anyway, I think in volume 34 of this thing, he, on a certain date that we know exactly, I think it was the 6th of December, 1273 or something, he was saying Mass as usual. And afterwards, he said, "I can write no more." And his private secretary said, "What do you mean? You can't not write. What is it?" And he said something really rather moving. He said, "I charge you by the love you have for our brotherhood and for me, that you never say and tell anyone this in my lifetime, but compared with anything I've been able to see or write, what I have seen this morning makes it all but straw or chaff. The husks that are blowing away in the wind." So it's a wonderful thing. And of course, people have said, well, he must have had a stroke or something like that. But I do look at that, and I look at the papers that have suggested this, but there's absolutely no evidence that he either couldn't speak or couldn't think. He carried on living and talking, but he just decided that his writing was beside the point, which is all in keeping with, what I was saying, that in the Tao Te Ching, he who knows does not speak. And that comes back to the essential conundrum I faced in writing this chapter. Did I simply accept that everything I would say could be easily faulted and shown to be wrong, because it is impossible to express this, or to fail the best I could? And I decided, well, I must give it my best attempt. It cost me dearly, but that's it. And I won't try to talk any more about it in future, I suppose, but it's there it is.
Well, if you failed gloriously. Just another example. You write, and of course you draw from other people, but you put it in this way. So to affirm the truth of being and the truth of nothing, and their unity is becoming.
Yes. And that's what we have. It's this interesting thing that there is the being and the not being that come together in becoming, which is not fully the one or the other, but it's a really important element here.
Yes.
And in relation to nothing itself, and being a kind of something, there is this important point that it took the invention of the digit 0 by Indian philosophers, in what we would call the Dark Ages, because the Greeks didn't have it, and that sort of limited their way of thinking and their use of mathematics. But it was the ability to bring about this thing that is, as it were, a nothing, but as a something that can be a placeholder. Do you see? Again, it's this idea of a place that needs to be there.
Yes.
And perhaps ultimately, the Euler equation, which fills me with awe every time I utter it, e to the I pi equals -1. And that already involves a placeholder, which is I, which is the root of -1. Well, of course, we cannot calculate a root for -1, but by raising E, which is another constant that comes from somewhere completely different, to the power of I, this imaginary number, times pi, the famous relationship between the radius and the diameter of and radius and the circumference of a circle, you find -1, which is itself a negation of something, but it's very real. This dance between the nothing and the something, which actually results nonetheless in something positive, in being able to do mathematics, in being able to create beautiful art, in all the beauty of worship, in the position the left hemisphere can adopt of a kind of theology that can help us see things, as long as it doesn't become overstrident about its expressions. We're there.
And one of the interpretations of quantum mechanics that I like, and I like it to express it like this, is that the imaginary part, and I took this from, by the way, from Jonathan Alday, who's a professor, a teacher, and also has written a few books about quantum mechanics, that the imaginary is real. It's not just a tool, which it is. When I was taught imaginary numbers in physics, right? Yes, okay, now you have this plane and you can do all these things. You can do integrals, like from a utilitarian point of view, you can solve certain integrals by going to the complex plane and then going back, fine. Yeah. But quantum mechanics seems to indicate that the imaginary is real. And how I conceptualize this is because maybe it has to do with this realm of the unmanifest or the potential, which belongs to the real, but will then manifest and become actual. But that doesn't negate that it was real in the first place.
That's lovely. I thank you very much for that. That's a great contribution to that. And I liked your use of the word "not manifest," because I think that is a very important point in all traditions, that there are things that are hidden but are perfectly real, can't be put into ordinary language, but are nonetheless real for that. And that's behind Bohr's saying about the way in which we need to approach physics. It's there in all the traditions, and it's there in Goethe, who talks about nature as an eternal open secret. It is both secret and open. It's entirely what it is, there where it is. And yet what it is something that requires exploration, requires a process of approach, a response, a coming to know. But it's in its nature hidden. And that takes me back again to Heraclitus, who said, nature loves to hide. Now that is a great, great saying. Anyway. We could talk very long.
Well, loves to hide in plain sight, I could add.
Hidden in plain sight, exactly that. No, that is right. The world is hidden in plain sight. And as long as you see it through the left hemisphere lens, it will remain an impossibility, a mystery, and nothing. Has no meaning. But seen another way, then, as Blake said it, the doors of perception are cleansed, and then one sees a world which is eternal and beautiful. That was what he had to say, and I think he's had more great insights than many people in Western history for centuries. So
now, Ian, after 2 hours, I still want to talk about something, because you end the last chapter of The Matter with Things with what it starts, and we'll discuss it in a minute. It'll start with something important, but it ends with a very worrisome warning. At least that's how I read it in the end. This is the section called, when the left hemisphere takes it upon itself to be the master, Lucifer rebels. Let's talk about this, and let's see where we finish, because you speak about the third time. It doesn't mean to be a spoiler, but you end with the warning back to this myth of Iroquois. Well, this is the third go. Maybe it's our last go.
Yes.
But before that, you talk about religious dogmatism and militant atheism, and we should say something about this. And this is just preparation, as I see it, for your kind of quasi-prophetic warning. So it doesn't end with flowers and music. It ends with, let's be really, really careful. We're playing with fire here.
Yes. Well, that is right. We need to be vigilant and careful. I suppose what I'm saying about fundamentalism is that there is very, very much in common between fundamentalist atheists and fundamentalist theists. And I regret very much the rise of fundamentalism in religion, which shows all the hallmarks of the left hemisphere. I'm right, you're wrong, certainty, revulsion from implicit meaning in poetry, in music, in dance, in humor. All these things are too unreliable, too not under control. It's a terribly destructive impulse. It's the impulse behind Puritanism. It will end with the destruction. We're already beginning to see this of parts of our culture that are being banned, destroyed, and taken away. This is something I never thought I would see in my lifetime. So there is a worry about a secular fundamentalism, a religious fundamentalism, and an atheist fundamentalism that all exhibit this very simplistic take on the world, and have alarmingly, and I can only just refer to this in passing, but I hope I deal with it sensitively and with proper scientific backing, that it also tends to indicate a certain cast of mind that on psychological testing has certain characteristics which are not particularly attractive. They tend to be anger, self-righteousness, and a sort of contempt for others. So I think that there is a worry there. I won't overemphasize it, but I think what I see there is a description of the left hemisphere dominating the way in which people think. And then you mentioned, of course, the Onondaga legend, the Iroquois legend of the two brothers, which I begin the part 3 with. And in that story, as people will remember, there are these two brothers, and one of them needs to keep the other one close to him so that it won't be destructive but can take part in the creative process. And he says that, they will leave having done their job of creation, and if people begin to adopt the way of the blinded or evil brother, they will suffer, and they will suffer through a kind of anger that I have taken from that brother himself. They will suffer his fire. And in those circumstances, I will come back once, I will come back twice, but the third time I will not come back. Now, the resonance for me is that, as people may know, in The Master and His Emissary, I deal with the history of the West, and I deal with the fall of Greece, the fall of Rome, and I'm predicting the fall of our civilization now. We can stop it, but we're doing our best to commit suicide as a civilization. In my view, we're undermining it, we're destroying it, we're attacking it, and we're attacking, of course, the natural world. So we might be in that position. I'm not predicting anything because I don't have a crystal ball, and as Whitehead himself says, prophets have a rather bad track record, and perhaps the way to deal with them is to take them out and mercifully stone them. And so I don't want to become one of those prophets. But when people ask me, I say, well, are you a pessimist? And I say, well, I think I'm a hopeful pessimist, which means that my intellectual assessment is that things are not going well, but that I retain hope because we can't actually know the future completely. That's the whole point I'm saying. And also because in humans there are hidden unused resources that if we act rapidly enough to remobilize them, we can actually save ourselves. Although maybe the important thing is that the world will carry on whether we're here or not. Some human beings will survive, and maybe a different and more sacred order will be re-established.
It's a harsh warning. Let me just reiterate.
Yes.
Yes. And you end with that. And you also add, let me just go there. You also add, I have nothing to add.
Yes, that's right. That's true. I have nothing to add to that. Yes. And perhaps it's worth just referring to the very end of the epilogue, or maybe we don't need to, because we do have one more talk together, don't we? So perhaps I won't spoil it by going there now?
No, we'll do one last one.
Yes.
Special one, hopefully. But maybe to end on a more high note, let me ask you one last thing, if you may, because you write about the soul here in this chapter, and you
Yes.
write only the human soul is left to resist this process. And I thought, wow, so rather than saving our soul, probably the soul will save us.
Yes, we need to rediscover ourselves, and that may be what will alert us to what's going on around us. I think, as you know, I gave a talk which is probably up on the internet, I don't know, at the Paris Centre, in which I devoted the entire talk to the soul, what we mean by it, whether it matters, what can is there a purpose for having the word, keeping the concept, and so on. And I argue very strongly that there is, and that it's rediscovering that will enable us to be able to respond to the sacred in the way that I've tried to describe. But of course, to talk about the soul at any length would take a long time. It'll be an hour on that occasion, so I won't duplicate that. But the soul is, yes, is a very important concept, and it can't be dispensed with, and is often called on in great literature and in great moments in life as a way of situating the individual in a much greater field than the immediate here and now, a greater field in space, a greater field in time, and a different aspect that goes beyond the purely intellectual and the purely emotional, but accesses this part of us that I think that responds to the sacred in me, in music, in worship, in art. And yes, very important. And it may not be relevant, but I like the idea that it comes from a root which means shakenness of water, the water that is stirred or shaken. According to Max Muller, anyway, who was a very great philologist, one of the greatest philologists of all time, he takes it back to a Sanskrit root, which means the water that is tossed or shaken. And I like that a lot. I think it's an important one. There was a Czech philosopher, Jan Patočka, who talked about the importance of shakenness. He was speaking in Soviet Czechoslovakia, but he was talking about recovering a sense of there's more than is in our complacent vision of the world, and we need to be shaken awake, and I think that's right. I think some of our crises will shake people awake, and maybe the soul will be heard again. I hope so. There's a lovely saying by Rabindranath Tagore, which I can't pass up the opportunity to repeat, which is that the small truth is like water in a glass, pure, clear, radiant. But the great truth is like water in the sea, mysterious, dark, obscure. And I think what we've been talking about here is the great truth in this chapter, coming back to the idea that it's hidden in nature, but that it is our task to work towards understanding it, revealing it, and holding it, although we don't really know precisely what it is.
Well, I can only say thank you, Ian. Thank you for attempting doing it, for writing the matter with things. And also, because we are in this chapter, may I say, God bless you for what you've done.
Thank you.
And may your, as I told you before, may your words help us heal the world and ourselves.
Thank you very much for those words. And yes, I resonate with that. And thank you, if I may say so, for being such a kind, acute, patient interrogator and conversational partner. You've been very kind on the interrogation, but I have very much enjoyed the experience, and we haven't quite finished yet. So there will be one more, the epilogue. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Till then.
See you then.